The sun burned low over the horizon, painting the desert in streaks of gold and crimson. Wind whispered through the brittle sagebrush and rattled dry bones half buried in the sand. A lone Apache walked beside his weathered dog, their shadows stretching long across the wasteland. Both had been wandering for days, following no trail but the one that called to the spirit inside him, the call of land, memory, and something older than either of them could name. When they finally reached the small rise overlooking a forgotten hollow, he saw it, an abandoned wickiup half sunk into the earth, reeds and willow bent with time. It stood alone, silent as a grave, yet somehow waiting. He stopped, his hand resting on the hilt of his worn knife. The dog lowered its head, sniffing the air, tail stiff. For the first time in days, the warrior felt the faint pull of belonging, but mixed with it was unease. No smoke rose from the pit outside the hut. No footprints marked the dust. Still, the place carried a strange kind of warmth, as if someone had left only moments before. He could almost hear the echo of voices around a fire, laughter swallowed by years. The dog gave a low growl. The Apache's fingers tightened on the strap around his shoulder. It was not in his nature to fear. He had slept among rattlesnakes and hunted cougars with nothing but a spear. But something about the stillness here unsettled him. The wind seemed to circle back, carrying whispers that didn't belong to the desert. He stepped closer, the dry earth crunching beneath his bare feet. The wickiup leaned slightly to one side, its entrance a dark mouth staring into his soul. He crouched, listening. Only the faint hum of the wind replied. He parted the flap and looked inside. The air inside was cooler, thick with the scent of old smoke and dried sage. A broken pot lay near the hearth. Animal bones and feathered charms hung from the poles, swaying slightly though no breeze entered. The Apache touched one of them and felt a faint vibration, as though it remembered the hands that had made it. He had seen many shelters like this, built by those who had lived and vanished long before the wars between his people and the whites. But this one felt different, too alive for something long abandoned. The dog refused to enter. It sat just outside the doorway, ears pricked and eyes fixed on something invisible beyond the hills. The warrior clicked his tongue, but the animal only whimpered softly. That was rare. This was no ordinary dog. It had traveled through battle and storm beside him, guarding him from every danger. If it hesitated now, something unseen was near. He looked again toward the horizon, where the red sun sank behind distant mesas. The shadows seemed to shift like restless spirits. He decided to stay the night. The desert was merciless after sundown, and firelight was safer than open sky. He unpacked a small bundle, flint, jerky, and a deer hide, and began to build a fire near the center of the wickiup. The dog circled the doorway, tail low, eyes never leaving the darkness outside. When the flames caught, the orange glow filled the hut and cast flickering shapes on the walls. The Apache sat cross-legged, staring into the fire, feeling both peace and unease, twisting together inside him. As the night deepened, the dog's restlessness grew. It would raise its head suddenly, ears twitching, then give a deep, warning growl toward the entrance. The warrior listened closely. Beyond the crackle of the fire, he could hear faint noises, not the calls of coyotes or the scuttle of desert rats, but something heavier. Footsteps, or the sigh of wind dragging across the sand. His hand moved to his bow, instinct sharp as ever. But no one came. He spoke quietly to the dog, using words in the old tongue. "It is only the spirits of this place," he said. "They remember us." Yet even as he spoke, he wasn't sure he believed it. His grandmother had once told him stories of dwellings that kept the souls of those who died inside them. Homes that called travelers to finish what the dead could not. He had laughed at those tales once. Now under the cold desert stars, it felt less like stories and more like warnings. The dog whined, low and trembling, and stepped backward, its gaze fixed on the far corner of the wickiup. The Apache turned slowly. In the flicker of the firelight, he thought he saw movement, a shadow pulling away from the wall, almost human in shape, vanishing before he could focus. He rose silently, every muscle alert. The dog growled again, deeper this time. The hair on its back stood upright. He approached the corner and brushed aside a heap of dried grass. Beneath it, His fingers touched something smooth and cold. He pulled it free and saw a small carved stone, shaped like a face, its features worn away by time. The mouth was open, as if crying or whispering. He turned it over in his palm and felt a faint warmth, impossible for stone. The moment he did, the wind outside howled, slamming against the wickiup with sudden fury. The fire sputtered. The dog barked once, loud and fierce, before retreating to the edge of the hut. The Apache stood motionless. The wind fell silent again just as suddenly. Only the faint sound of breathing his and the dog's filled the air. He placed the stone near the fire, studying it. The strange warmth pulsed through the ground itself now, almost like a heartbeat. The longer he stared, the stronger the feeling became that he was not alone. He looked toward the entrance. Outside, the desert was still. The moon had risen, pale and heavy. The sand glimmered like frost. And then he noticed the prints, faint, but there. A single line of bare footprints leading toward the wickiup, stopping right outside the entrance where his dog now sat. No one had come since he arrived. He had circled the place himself when he first saw it. Those prints were not his. He stepped out, scanning the horizon. No movement. The air was colder now, sharp enough to sting the lungs. The dog sniffed the ground, whining again. The Apache crouched and touched one of the prints. It was fresh. Whoever or whatever made it had been there only moments ago. He rose quickly and looked into the distance. Nothing but desert and shadows. Yet the silence felt heavy, watchful. When he returned to the wickiup, the fire burned lower, its glow dim and trembling. The stone still lay by the flames, but now it looked darker, as if drawing in the light itself. The Apache sat again, his dog pressing close to his side. He could feel the animal's heartbeat racing. He reached out and stroked its fur. "We stay until dawn," he said softly. "Then we see what this place hides." The words hung in the air like a promise or a curse. The fire popped, sending sparks into the darkness, and for a fleeting moment he thought he heard a whisper inside the wind. Not from outside. From within the hut. A faint voice, breathless and near, as though the very walls were trying to speak. The dog barked sharply, teeth bared, staring into that same dark corner again. The Apache grabbed his knife and rose slowly, his eyes fixed on the shifting shadows. The air grew colder still, and something unseen brushed past his shoulder, something that felt almost human. He turned sharply, but there was nothing there. Only the whispering wind and the steady beat of his heart. He knew then that the wickiup was not as empty as it seemed. Something had been waiting for him here, and his dog had sensed it long before he did. What it was and what it wanted, he would not understand until the night revealed its truth. But by then, it might already be too late. The night dragged on with the kind of silence that presses against a man's chest until he can barely breathe. The Apache sat close to the fire, his eyes heavy, but his mind alert. He had lived through ambushes, storms, and starvation, but this silence felt different. It wasn't the kind that came from emptiness. It was the kind that listened back. The flames flickered against the curved walls of the wickiup, shadows bending and shifting like they were alive. The dog hadn't slept at all. It sat facing the entrance, ears twitching, every muscle tight. The Apache reached into the pouch at his side and pulled out a piece of dried venison, holding it toward the animal. "Eat," he murmured. The dog didn't move. It only gave a faint growl deep in its chest, its eyes still locked on the darkness outside. The warrior frowned, setting the meat down and feeding a few more sticks into the fire. Sparks leapt upward, and for a brief second, he thought he saw something in the smoke, a shape, a face maybe, but when he blinked, it was gone. He leaned back and tried to think clearly. Every warrior learns to read the land, to understand what the wind says, what the ground remembers. Yet this place spoke in riddles. The air carried the scent of sage and earth, but beneath it was something faint, like wet ashes after rain. He had smelled that before, long ago, at a burial ground. His grandmother used to say that certain places remembered pain so deep that even time couldn't wash it away. He turned his gaze toward the stone near the fire. It sat motionless, its carved face half lit by the flames. He didn't know what it meant, but he could feel its presence in the air, like the weight of someone standing right behind him. He thought about leaving, just taking the dog and walking into the desert again. But something inside him refused. He wasn't running from ghosts or shadows. Not after all he had survived. He would face whatever lingered here and learn its truth. Outside, the wind began to rise again. It swept across the open desert, carrying a low, mournful sound that almost resembled a voice. The Apache stepped to the doorway, pulling the animal hide flap aside. The moon was high now, pale and round. The sand shimmered under its light, turning the world silver and cold. The footprints he had seen earlier were still there, and now beside them was another trail, faint but new. Smaller prints spaced close together, as if someone barefoot had walked in circles near the wickiup. He crouched, touching the ground. The prints were light, almost delicate, and they hadn't been there before nightfall. He straightened, his pulse steady but strong. The dog stepped out behind him, sniffing the air. Then, without warning, it barked sharply toward the distant ridge. The sound echoed across the valley, sharp and lonely. The Apache peered into the darkness, but saw only sand and sagebrush. Nothing moved. He waited, listening. Then he heard it, a faint rustle, not far off, followed by the sound of something brushing against dry grass. He knocked an arrow and stepped forward slowly, every movement deliberate. The dog stayed close, growling softly. They moved toward the sound, following it past a cluster of yucca plants and scattered stones. The noise stopped. Then, from behind one of the rocks came a small shape, a desert hare. It froze in the moonlight, eyes wide, before darting away. The Apache lowered his bow and exhaled quietly. Still, couldn't shake the feeling that the hare hadn't been the source of all that unease. He turned back toward the wickiup, but the dog remained staring at the ridge, tail stiff. The warrior looked again. The ridge was still dark, but for a moment. He thought he saw something tall standing there, something that vanished when the clouds crossed the moon. He felt the skin on his arms tighten. The dog whined, and together they returned to the wilk. Inside, the fire was almost dead. He added a few branches and sat again, facing the doorway. The night stretched long, each hour feeling heavier than the last. When morning finally came, the first rays of sun touched the desert, casting long shadows through the cracks in the hut. The dog had finally lain down, though its eyes stayed open. The Apache rose, stepping outside into the cool morning air. The desert felt different in daylight, wide open and harmless. The prints were still there, but fainter now. He followed them a short distance, tracing the smaller ones. They led toward a patch of rocky ground and then disappeared. He searched for signs, broken twigs, bent grass, but found nothing. It was as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. As he walked back, he noticed something near the wickiup that hadn't been there before. A small bundle of dried sage and cedar branches tied with a strip of hide. It lay just at the entrance, placed carefully, not dropped. He crouched and picked it up, studying it. It was an offering the kind his people used in old cleansing rituals, meant to keep evil spirits away. But who would have left it here? He brought it inside and placed it beside the fire pit. Maybe whoever lived here before had tried to keep something out or trap something within. The thought unsettled him more than the night itself. He decided to explore farther before the sun rose too high. He whistled for his dog, slung his bow across his back, and headed toward the foothills to the west. The landscape was harsh but beautiful. Joshua trees stood like watchmen over the barren earth. A hawk circled far above, its cry echoing in the open sky. He found traces of old trails, the kind made by people long gone. A few broken stones marked with symbols. A clay shard, half buried near a dry stream bed. Someone had lived here once, maybe many seasons ago. He could almost feel their presence still clinging to the air. By midday he found a small canyon not far from the wickiup. A trickle of water ran through the rocks, feeding a cluster of willows. He knelt and drank deeply, letting the cold water cool his mind. The dog waded in beside him, lapping eagerly. As he rested, he noticed something carved into the canyon wall, faint lines forming a symbol. It was the same shape as the stone face he had found the night before, a circle with a hollow center and two curved marks above it, like eyes. He touched the carving, tracing its edges. It wasn't a symbol of his people. It belonged to an older time, maybe to those who lived in this land before even the Apache came. His grandmother used to say, the desert was full of forgotten spirits, not all friendly, not all evil, just lost. Some waited for those who would listen to their stories. Others waited for those foolish enough to wake them. As the sun dipped lower, he made his way back. From the ridge, he could see smoke rising faintly above the wickiup. He hadn't left any fire burning. His pace quickened. When he reached the clearing, the smoke was gone, but the smell lingered, sweet and sharp, like burning sage. Inside, the hut was empty, the fire pit cold. The bundle he had placed by the stones was gone. The dog paced in circles, uneasy again. The Apache crouched near the hearth and noticed faint ash on the floor. The remains of the offering burned clean. Whoever or whatever had taken it hadn't left tracks this time. He looked toward the small stone figure he had found. It was still there, but its surface was darker now. It's almost black. He sat in silence for a long while, his thoughts drifting between reason and superstition. Maybe someone else wandered these lands and used the same shelter. Or maybe this place carried the memory of something older, something neither living nor dead. That night, as darkness returned, he built a new fire. He spoke softly in the old language, the one his mother had taught him by the riverside when he was a child. He spoke not to summon anything, but to show respect. The flames rose higher, and the shadows gathered again along the walls. The dog suddenly lifted its head, staring at the doorway. The Apache followed its gaze. A faint shape stood just beyond the entrance, half hidden in the moonlight. It was tall and still, the outline of a figure watching them. He reached for his knife, but the figure didn't move. Then, as the wind blew, it dissolved into smoke and vanished into the night air. The dog whimpered softly, pressing close to him. The Apache sat frozen, the hair on his arms standing. He knew the desert had its secrets, but never had he felt its breath so near. He turned back to the fire, its light trembling like it too was afraid. Outside, the wind began to rise again, circling the wickiup. It carried a faint voice, neither man nor woman, whispering words in a language he didn't know. The sound seeped through the cracks in the hut, wrapping around him like the touch of something unseen. He looked down at the dog, its eyes wide and unblinking. Something in this land was waking, and though he didn't yet understand its purpose, he felt deep in his bones that his life and his dog's were now bound to this place. The wickiup had chosen them, and it would not let them go easily. The wind kept circling the wickiup as if it were tracing an old trail it could not leave. The Apache sat with his back to the curved poles and studied the small stone face by the fire. Each time the flame breathed, the carved mouth seemed to open wider. He did not reach for it. He watched. The dog paced a slow path from doorway to hearth, nails clicking softly on packed earth. When the animal finally stopped, it pressed its nose to the floor and gave a muffled whine. The Apache knelt. Under the thin layer of dust was a weave of grass and sinew that did not belong to the shelter. He lifted it carefully and uncovered a child's bracelet made from bird bones and a single blue bead. It was the kind of thing a loving hand makes during long winter nights. He held the bracelet in his palm, felt the tug of something older than grief. The dog sneezed, then turned its head sharply toward the doorway. Footsteps approached across the sand, steady and cautious. The Apache did not stand. He let the visitor see the glow of the fire and his open hands. A voice came first, dry and frayed like yucca fiber. It was a woman's voice asking for the kind of help one only asks at the edge of fear. He rose then and parted the flap. A lone rider sat on a small dun horse. The woman was thin, wrapped in a blanket patched so many times the original cloth could not be guessed. Her hat shaded her eyes, but he could see they were swollen from lack of sleep. A coil of rope hung from her saddle along with 2 dented canteens. She studied him for a long breath, then looked past him to the dog, then to the fire. She said she was from the far side of the ridge where a short creek fed into a shallow wash. She said a small group of ranch families had settled there. With permission from a traveling agent who promised good grass and peace. Then she said a little girl had gone missing 2 nights ago. The Apache listened without moving. The woman spoke in a way that tried to be calm. It was the kind of calm people use when panic stands right behind them. The group had followed tiny prints until the wind took them. Someone said they had seen smoke from this hollow. Someone said the old stories about wickiup should not be woken. The woman had come alone because the others were angry, and anger rarely asks the right questions. The girl's name, she did not speak. As if saying it might set loose a worse fear, he walked to the edge of the fire and placed the bracelet on a strip of hide. The woman's eyes found it at once. She did not step forward. She did not speak. The dog watched both of them, tail low, but no longer trembling. The Apache asked where the prints had first led. The woman pointed toward the canyon with the willows. He nodded once, then offered water and a spot by the fire. She refused the warmth but accepted the drink, keeping her eyes on the bracelet. Finally, she asked where he found it. He told her. He did not tell her about the footprints that began at the doorway where no one had stepped. Before dawn, he covered the stone face with the hide and stepped out into the cooling dark. The woman rode beside him, quiet as a shadow. The dog ran ahead, nose to the earth. When the first light climbed the mesa, the dog stopped at a patch of ground near a lopsided yucca. It pawed twice and looked up. The Apache knelt and brushed away sand. There lay a second bead, not blue this time, but the cloudy white of river glass. It had been pressed into the earth by a small heel. The woman's breath caught, yet she still did not speak the child's name. They followed the faint signs into the canyon. The water there was thin but clean, and the stones along the bank were marked with the same circle and eyes carved into the wall. Here the Apache felt the land's breath change, as if the canyon itself listened. He placed his palm on the carving and closed his eyes. He saw the wickiup as it had been years ago, when reed walls were bright and new. He saw a man shaping the small stone figure with careful strokes, a woman weaving grass mats, a child laughing at a coyote that pretended bravery and fled when the man stamped his foot. The vision faded like smoke pulled by wind. The Apache opened his eyes. The woman was staring at the same carving with an expression that mixed awe and dread. She had seen something too, though what it was she kept inside. They found no more beads. Only a ribbon of yucca fiber snagged on a thorn and a line of disturbed dust leading toward a split in the rock. The dog pressed its nose into the crack and wind, then drew back with a short bark. The passage was too narrow for a rider. The woman tied her horse to a willow and followed on foot. Inside, the air cooled fast. The passage widened into a chamber where shafts of light slid down from holes in the roof. The Apache felt the same warmth he had felt in the wickiup, a pulse from the ground. The dog sniffed, circled once, then lay down near a pile of stones as if guarding something that could not be seen. Under that pile, they found a shallow cache. Inside were simple things: a clay cup, a knit of rabbit fur, a small flute made from bone, and a bundle of dried sage tied with hide. The woman did not touch any of it. The Apache lifted the sage and smelled the same sweet smoke from the night before. He replaced it gently. Then he noticed marks on the wall behind the cache. They were no symbols, only scratches made by a small hand, lines that went up and down as if counting or pleading. The woman raised her fingers to them, then lowered her hand. She said the little girl had learned to count only of late. Proud of each number as if it were a new word, the dog rose and walked to the far side of the chamber, where the light made a pale path on the floor. It began to dig at the sand with slow, careful strokes. The Apache moved quickly and placed his palm on the animal's back. The dog stopped, looking up with soft, questioning eyes. The woman stepped closer. The Apache shook his head. He could feel it through the soles of his feet now, a hum that came from the stone itself. Digging here felt like stepping into a promise he did not yet understand. They left the chamber in silence. At the mouth of the passage, the woman said others would come by nightfall. Men with rifles and a few with old grudges. They would not like finding an Apache living in the abandoned shelter so near their cattle. They would see the bracelet as proof of what they already believed. The Apache stared toward the wickiup that was a tight circle in the distance. He said the girl was not taken by a living hand. He did not say the word spirit because the woman already knew. And naming it would only sharpen the fear. When they returned to the shelter, the sky had turned hard and bright. The woman's horse nickered and tossed its head as if smelling rain that would never come. The wickiup felt changed, the air inside. The dog froze at the doorway and lifted its nose high. It walked not to the hearth, but to the far corner, the same corner that had drawn its gaze on the first night. The Apache lifted the grass mat there and found the packed earth disturbed. Inside the shallow space lay a second cache. Unlike the canyon cache, this one felt new. He lifted a folded cloth, and a rush of cold passed up his arms. The cloth belonged to a child. It was stitched with clumsy stars and edged with blue thread. The woman pressed her fingers to her lips. The Apache unfolded the cloth, and a smell of wildflowers rose that had no business in this dry country. Inside were small bones of birds tied like charms. The dog whimpered again, quieter now, more sorrow than warning. Before they could speak, a sound came from the ridge. The woman stepped to the doorway and looked out. Dust trailed from 3 riders heading straight toward the hollow. She said one of them was a lawman from the settlement. He was known to seek quick answers, and he liked answers that fit a story he already carried. The Apache looked at the small stone face by the fire. He wrapped it in hide and tucked it into his pouch. Then he turned to the woman and told her to stay calm and speak first when they arrived. She nodded, though fear had found her hands. The riders came in a line, the lawman in front. He wore a star pinned to his vest and eyes that stayed cold no matter the sun. Behind him rode a ranch hand with a scarred cheek and a young drifter whose boots looked too new for this country. They slowed near the wickiup but did not dismount. The lawman scanned the clearing, rested his gaze on the dog, then on the Apache. He said he wanted to look inside. The woman spoke at once, telling him the Apache was helping and that the bracelet had been found in the shelter. It might have belonged to a child who once lived here. The lawman listened with a face made from dry wood. The scarred ranch hand watched the dog with the look a man gives a wolf. The young drifter glanced again and again at the ridge, as if someone stood there besides them. The Apache stepped aside and waved the men in. They entered with the caution of people who do not believe in spirits, but who do not laugh at them either. The lawman inspected the hearth and the corner where the cache had been. He saw the cloth and reached for it. The woman asked him not to handle it with rough hands. He ignored the request, but held the cloth in a way that showed some care. The dog watched him closely and gave a low growl when the lawman lifted the cloth above the firelight. The lawman lowered it without comment and asked the Apache where he had been the night the girl vanished. The Apache answered. He spoke plain. He did not mention the stone, the prints that began at the doorway, or the way the wind had listened. The lawman said he would return at sunset with more men and that no one should leave the area. He spoke to the woman, not to the Apache, but his words settled on both of them. Then he turned his horse and rode off, the other 2 following. The young drifter looked back once, his face pale. He had seen the carving on the canyon wall earlier that day while riding fence. He had not told the lawman because the symbol made his mouth dry and the air in his chest thin. He would keep it to himself a little longer, telling himself there was no reason to bring old stories into a new mess. When the riders disappeared behind the ridge, the woman let out a breath. The Apache stepped outside and scanned the rim of the hollow. In the bright light, he saw faint smears where the prints had been, wiped away by the morning wind. He felt the wickiup at his back, like a presence that had learned to stand. He knew a line had been crossed when he opened the first cache. Now more lives were tied to that choice. The lawman's return would bring a hard edge to an already sharp situation. If the men arrived angry, the land would remember their anger long after they were gone. The dog trotted to the edge of the clearing and lifted its muzzle, drawing in the wind. Then it took off at a lope toward the canyon. The Apache followed with the woman behind him at a slower pace. The dog led them not to the first chamber, but to a narrow ledge above it, where a thin seam of rock broke like an old scar. There, in a shallow pocket, lay a bundle of dried flowers braided with long strands of hair, the pale color of wheat. The woman touched the braid and closed her eyes. When she opened them, a strange steadiness filled her face. She said the girl had hair like this, and would often weave it with grasses when she played by the wash. The Apache inspected the rock pocket more closely and found a trace of soot. A small fire had been lit here in the past day, not for warmth, but for smoke. He remembered the smell that had greeted them at the wickiup when they returned from the canyon. Some presence had been moving between shelter and rock, burning sage and leaving small signs for those who understood. He looked out over the valley and felt the desert turn quiet again, the way it does when a hawk watches from high and nothing below dares to stir. By late afternoon they returned to the wickiup. The wind had shifted. Darker clouds gathered over the mesas, promising heat lightning more than rain. The Apache sat at the hearth and unwrapped the stone face. He placed it near the cloth and the bracelet. The three objects seemed to belong together, yet they pressed against one another like strangers in a small room. He spoke in the old tongue, asking the land to show its straight path. The dog lay with its chin on its paws, eyes open, ears flicking to sounds the human ear could not catch. From far off came the thin clatter of horses. The lawman was returning earlier than expected. The Apache rose and stepped to the doorway. The woman stood beside him, her mouth set, not in anger, but resolve. Together, they watched the riders approach in a wider group, dust rising like a low storm. The dog stood and gave a single quiet bark, a sound more like a vow than a warning. The wind changed again, bringing with it the smell of wet ashes after rain and the soft impression that someone unseen had come to stand behind them. Close enough to be felt but not seen, the Apache understood then that the main struggle was no longer only about a missing child. It was also about the story people would choose to tell when the men arrived. One story would point at him and at the past, easy to lift like a rifle. The other story would point at the land itself, at the things that asked to be understood rather than feared. He did not know which story would win when the horses stopped outside and the lawman raised a hand for silence. He only knew the wickiup had gathered them all for a reason, and that the reason had not shown its full face yet. The riders stopped at the edge of the clearing, their horses restless under the thickening wind. The lawman sat straight in the saddle, his face a cold mask beneath the brim of his hat. Behind him, scarred ranch hand shifted his rifle, while the young drifter glanced at the wickiup with uneasy eyes, like he could already feel the weight of something wrong hanging over the place. The woman stood beside the Apache, her breath shallow, hands gripping the edge of her shawl. The dog stayed close to the doorway, silent now, tail stiff, watching the horses with the same sharp focus it used when sensing danger in the wild. The lawman dismounted first. He didn't speak right away. He looked at the sky, then at the ground, then straight at the Apache. "We're going to end this business tonight," he said. "The folks by the creek are restless, and they're saying, 'Your kind brought something here that shouldn't be.'" His words were steady, but his tone carried that old distrust, heavy and familiar. The Apache didn't move. He stood with the patience of stone. He said, "I brought nothing here." It was already waiting. The lawman's jaw tightened, like he was holding back a curse. He turned to the woman. "You said he found something in that shelter. I'll see it myself." The woman hesitated, but the Apache gave a small nod. She led them inside. The dog growled when the lawman stepped through the entrance, but a soft word from its master quieted it. The men looked around the small space, their boots scraping the packed dirt. The fire had burned low, sending up a thin stream of smoke that twisted toward the roof. The small stone face lay near the cloth and bracelet. The lawman crouched, studying them. He reached out, touched the carved stone and flinched slightly, though he tried not to show it. "Cold," he muttered. "Too cold for something sitting by the fire." The scarred ranch hand spat on the ground. "He's been here alone with these things. Same time a child disappears. That ain't a trail you ignore." His voice carried an edge meant to stir the others. The woman stepped between him and the Apache. "He's been helping me," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You don't understand what's happening here. There's something wrong with this land," the ranch hand sneered. "Always something wrong when blood's involved." The lawman raised a hand for silence. "We'll see the canyon," he said. "If that's where you claim you found the signs, then that's where we'll start." He picked up the stone figure, ignoring the Apache's warning look, and slipped it into his saddlebag. The air seemed to tighten as he did. The fire dimmed slightly, and the dog began to whimper again. None of the men noticed, but the woman did. She glanced at the Apache, whose face was still, though his eyes were darker now. They set out toward the canyon, under a lowering sky. The air smelled of dust and metal. Lightning flashed far to the west, silent and quick. The Apache walked behind the riders, his dog beside him, their steps soundless in the sand. The woman rode ahead but often looked back, her face pale. When they reached the canyon mouth, the horses balked. The lawman forced his forward, cursing under his breath. The Apache felt the same pull, not of fear, but warning. The land itself seemed restless. Like a drumbeat building below the surface, they dismounted and entered the narrow passage one by one. The young drifter held a lantern that threw long shadows over the rock walls. When the light passed over the carvings, the air grew colder. The same circle and dies mark glimmered faintly, as if the stone remembered the flame. The lawman stopped and frowned. "What kind of marking is that?" he asked. The Apache said, "It is not of my people. It belongs to the first ones who walked this land before us. Some say they never left." The lawman snorted. "Superstition." Yet his voice sounded hollow in the echoing stone. The deeper they went, the stronger the scent of sage and smoke became. The drifter coughed and muttered something about not liking the smell. Then the dog stopped suddenly and barked once, sharp and urgent. The sound bounced through the chamber ahead, breaking the silence. The Apache stepped forward quickly, hand out. "Quiet," he said. But the dog's eyes were locked on the far side of the cavern, where the rock met shadow. The Apache raised the torch higher, and the light revealed the small cache they had seen before, except now it was open. The bone flute was gone. The pile of stones disturbed. The woman gasped. The lawman turned on her. "You said you didn't touch it." She shook her head. "I didn't. It wasn't like this." The ranch hand drew his rifle. "Something's playing games." The Apache moved closer and crouched near the disturbed stones. Beneath them, faint prints crossed the sand, the same small footprints he had seen by the wickiup. They led toward the back of the chamber and stopped at the wall as if the child had walked into the stone itself. He placed his hand there. The surface was warm. "The spirit is awake," he said quietly. "It moves between what is seen and what is buried." "Hey!" The lawman's patience broke. "Enough of your riddles," he barked. "If you know what happened here, you'll speak it plain before the men back at the settlement come looking for you." He took a step forward, grabbing the Apache's shoulder. The moment his hand made contact, the ground trembled softly, a low vibration like thunder beneath their feet. The horses outside whinnied and kicked at the sand. The drifter dropped the lantern, and it shattered, the flame dying in a puff of smoke. Darkness swallowed the chamber. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a faint sound rose, the slow, breathy notes of a flute. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The tune was soft, almost sweet, but beneath it ran a sorrow that froze the heart. The woman covered her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks. The ranch hand cursed and fired a shot blindly toward the sound. The noise exploded through the canyon, shaking dust from the walls. The flute stopped. When the echo faded, the only sound was the rasp of breathing. The lawman struck a match and lit another lantern. Its flickering glow revealed the Apache standing still, eyes closed, lips moving in a whisper. The dog stood beside him, ears low, staring at the floor. The woman whispered, "It's her." The girl. The lawman turned sharply. "What did you say?" "She's here," the woman said softly, voice breaking. "She's been here all along." The Apache opened his eyes. "Not alive," he said, his tone heavy, but calm. "But not gone either." He stepped toward the back wall again and pressed his hand to the stone. The warmth pulsed stronger now, almost alive. The lawman drew his revolver. "Step away," he ordered. "You'll stop whatever it is you're doing." The Apache didn't move. The woman reached out to the lawman. "Please," she said. "You don't understand. The child's spirit is trapped. He's trying to help her." The lawman hesitated, torn between fear and authority. A deep rumble passed through the canyon. Pebbles rolled down from above. The air shimmered with heat and static, though no fire burned. The scarred ranch hand turned to run, but the passage behind them seemed to twist the way a mirage shifts in sunlight. The Apache took a step closer to the wall, his hand steady. "She calls to the one who listens," he said. "If we leave her, the land will not rest." The dog began to bark again, frantic this time, as if urging him. "Forward," the lawman shouted for everyone to get back. But his voice broke against the roar that filled the chamber, a mix of wind and crying, and the faint sound of the flute returning. The light dimmed. The shadows stretched like fingers across the walls. Then, in the middle of the swirling dust, a shape appeared, small, glowing faintly, like moonlight caught in water. The woman gasped, stepping forward despite herself. It was the outline of a child, hair floating as if underwater, eyes wide and sorrowful. The Apache lowered his head, whispering something in the old tongue. The lawman stumbled backward, face pale. He aimed his gun but couldn't bring himself to fire. The figure turned toward him, its mouth opening in silence. The air grew colder. The woman fell to her knees, whispering the girl's name for the first time. The echo of it rippled through the chamber. The child's ghost blinked once, then turned back toward the Apache. The flute's melody rose higher now, carrying through the rocks and the wind outside. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The glow vanished. The canyon fell still. The lantern flickered weakly, showing the wall again, unbroken, solid, lifeless. The woman began to cry quietly. The ranch hand crossed himself, muttering prayers. The lawman stood frozen, eyes darting between them all. The Apache turned slowly, his face pale but steady. "It is not finished," he said. "Something still binds her here." Outside, thunder cracked across the sky, rolling through the desert like a warning. They stepped out into the open, the wind tearing through their clothes. The wickiup in the distance looked smaller now, a dark shell against the storm. The lawman mounted his horse. "We ride back," he said, voice tight, "before this place swallows us." But as they started toward the hollow, lightning split the horizon, striking the ground near the shelter. Flames leapt for a moment, then vanished. The Apache stopped walking. The dog stood beside him, fur bristling, eyes fixed on the wickiup. The woman turned to look, her hand trembling on the reins. The lawman shouted for them to hurry, but she couldn't move. The Apache's gaze stayed on the distant smoke, rising from the spot that had once been his fire. He knew the land wasn't letting them go yet. The storm had come alive. Whatever had awakened inside the canyon had followed them out. The wind howled across the valley, and the dog barked into the storm, each sound swallowed by the thunder. The Apache tightened his grip on the bough at his back, feeling the pulse of the ground beneath his feet. Something was moving toward them, not from the sky, not from the canyon, but from the very heart of the earth. The air grew heavy, and in that thick silence between thunderclaps, they all heard it, a faint sound, like a child's laughter drifting through the storm. Growing closer with every breath, the laughter came faint at first, carried on the wind, and then it echoed across the valley like a voice from the earth itself. The riders froze. The lawman gripped the reins, his horse tossing its head nervously. The woman turned pale, her breath shaking, as she whispered the child's name into the storm. The Apache stood still, his dog pressed close to his side, its ears flat against the thunder. The desert around them seemed to breathe, every gust of wind pulling sand into small, spinning shapes that danced across the ground. Lightning flashed again, and for a heartbeat they saw her. The small figure of a girl, standing at the edge of the wickiup, her hair lifted by the storm, her outline glowing faintly in the dark. The Apache's eyes filled with quiet knowing. The woman gasped and tried to move toward the apparition, but the Apache raised his hand. "Wait," he said softly. She is not here to be taken back. She only wants to be free. The lawman pulled his horse closer, shouting to be heard over the wind. We have to get out of here. This isn't right. But his words seemed small against the roar of thunder. The child's figure turned toward the Apache. In the brief light of the storm, he could see her eyes sad, yes, but calm, like she had finally found someone who could hear her voice. She lifted her hand, and though she made no sound, the Apache understood. She wanted her story to be finished. He stepped forward slowly, each movement careful, his moccasins sinking into wet sand. The dog followed him, unafraid now, tail low but steady. The woman stood watching, tears streaking her face. The other said nothing. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath as the Apache approached the wickiup. The small form of the girl faded slightly with each step he took, but the air around her grew warmer, softer, on to carry in the faint scent of sage and smoke. When he reached the spot where she stood, he knelt, bowing his head. He whispered in the old language, words that were half prayer, half farewell. He asked the spirits of the land to open their hands, to let her rest where the wind meets the soil. The dog lay down beside him, its eyes on the flickering shape. The woman took a few steps forward, clutching the blue-beaded bracelet in her hand. She placed it on the ground near the Apache, whispering the child's name once more. The girl's figure turned toward her, and for a moment, there was a faint smile, small and fleeting, like the shimmer of morning dew before it dries. Then, the light around her burst outward in a soft glow that spread through the air like sunrise breaking through mist. The thunder ceased. The wind quieted. When the light faded, there was nothing left but silence and the smell of rain. The Apache opened his eyes and saw the bracelet lying in the sand, half buried, its blue bead catching the first light of dawn that had begun to edge over the horizon. The lawman dismounted slowly, his face pale, his gun forgotten in its holster. The woman walked to the spot where the apparition had been and knelt, her hands trembling. "She's gone," she said softly. "But she's home now." The Apache nodded. "The land keeps its own," he said. "It does not take without reason, and it does not forget what is lost." The men stood quietly, unsure of what they had witnessed. The scarred ranch hand finally spoke, his voice lower than before. "I don't know what that was, but I ain't ever speaking against this place again." The young drifter crossed himself, muttering that he'd seen enough to fill 10 lifetimes. The lawman said nothing. He only looked at the wickiup, his hard eyes softened by something he couldn't name, when the first true light of morning broke. The Apache began to gather his few belongings. The woman asked him what he would do now. He told her he would leave the wickiup to the wind, the way it should be. "This place doesn't belong to me," he said. "It belongs to the story that was waiting here." He looked at the dog, who wagged its tail once, ready to follow wherever the trail led next. The lawman approached him then, awkwardly, almost uncertain. "What happened here," he said, "will stay between us. The others don't need to know. They'll only twist it into something ugly." The Apache gave a slow nod. "Then speak truth when you can," he said. "That is enough." The lawman didn't reply, but he tipped his hat slightly, a small gesture of respect. The kind that carries weight when words fail. They all left the hollow before noon. The storm had passed, and the sky stretched wide and clear again. When they reached the ridge, the woman turned for one last look. From that distance, the wickiup seemed whole again, standing proud and silent in the golden light. But as the sun climbed higher, it faded from sight like dust caught in a beam of sunlight. She blinked, and it was gone. The Apache traveled north for several days, following the trails of dry washes and mesquite groves until the desert gave way to higher ground. He stopped one evening by a stream, his dog lying beside him, both watching the sunset paint the sky in red and amber. He reached into his pouch and took out the small stone face, the one the lawman had returned before leaving. It no longer felt cold. Its surface was warm, smooth, and calm, as if it had finally released what it once held. He placed it on a flat rock by the water and left it there. He built a small fire and sat quietly, listening to the night. Somewhere far away, a coyote called, and the sound echoed gently through the hills. He thought about the woman, the girl, and even the lawman. He thought about how every place keeps a piece of every life that touches it. Maybe that was the land's way of remembering through wind, through shadow, through the silence that follows. At dawn, he rose and continued his journey. The desert behind him was calm again, but every so often when the breeze shifted just right, he thought he could hear the faint notes of a flute carried on the wind. It was soft and distant, but no longer sorrowful. It sounded like a song of rest. The dog lifted its head at the sound, ears twitching, and the Apache smiled faintly. "She's free," he said. The dog gave a quiet bark, as if it understood. Far behind, near the place where the wickiup once stood, the woman built a small wooden cross beside the creek. She planted wildflowers there and left the blue-beaded bracelet hanging from it. When she returned weeks later, she found the flowers still blooming, even though the rest of the land was dry. She took it as a sign that peace had finally come. The lawman passed by that same place 1 year later while riding patrol. He saw the cross, paused for a moment, then tipped his hat before continuing on. The legend of the wickiup spread slowly among the settlers and the tribes alike. Some said the spirit of a lost child had been freed by an Apache wanderer and his loyal dog. Others said it was just a story told to remind people that the desert has a memory and that everything taken from it must someday be returned. For the Apache, it was simpler. He had seen how the land held pain and how it could also heal it. He carried that lesson with him wherever he went, that every soul, living or lost, is a part of the same earth beneath their feet. When he looked at the horizon, he no longer saw only sand and sky. He saw stories, each one buried in stone, waiting for someone to listen. And when the night came, and the stars gathered over the wide land, he lay beside his dog near the campfire and closed his eyes. The wind whispered softly through the sagebrush, gentle now, no longer burdened by sorrow. Somewhere out in the distance, a single note from a flute drifted through the air, not haunting this time, but peaceful. The Apache smiled, feeling the desert breathe with him, and let the sound fade into the quiet rhythm of the land that had finally found its rest.